very welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm going to say a few words now. Back in the 1980s, Field Day set out to achieve change through the power of ideas and fresh thinking. We began as a post-colonial project, and originally our focus was on culture and politics, but not so much on the environment. It was only much later that our thinking here matured, and that is as true of Field Day as it is of everyone else. In recent years, Field Day has leaned in much more into this field. Turns out that you can teach old dogs for the hard road new tricks. Field Day now, as never before, is aware of the crucial significance of this issue. In my case, my work as an ambassador for UNICEF has brought this issue home to me personally. Look at the state of that. The poor children. When I visited the global south, I encountered climate change up close and saw the inexorable impact that it is exerting. In Somalia, I met exhausted people who had been literally, not metaphorically, walking for weeks through new deserts, and it brought home to me the most visceral way how the global climate crisis impacts on the most vulnerable people in the world. It just makes you feel so useless and so angry when you look at a mother in the eye who has just lost a child on her journey to the camp that you're visiting, and whose other children are so dehydrated and exhausted they cannot feed. After that eye-to-eye encounter, you can never be the same again. I met this woman. She she had no milk left to feed her child. It's a big tragedy, you know, and it's a tragedy for her and all the children. In Ireland, we have an historical legacy of exposure to colonialism, famine, forced emigration, and centuries of economic exploitation as a source of cheap food for a powerful neighbour. If any country in the modern West should exercise consciousness, empathy, and advocacy on climate change, it should be us. That is why Field Day and the University of Notre Dame invited Amitav Ghosh to Ireland. Amitav is the crucial writer who has mainstreamed climate change within the post-colonial mode. He's a foremost global thinker on how the beginnings of our contemporary crisis can be traced back to the onset of modernity with the emergence of a rapacious global imperial and capitalist system. His compulsively readable book, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, it's like reading a shadow text on Ireland, even though it is set in the Banda Islands in Indonesia. Amitav has alerted us to the vast importance of ecocide, the deliberate destruction of ecosystems and environments. We in Ireland know something of that. As Banda was being depopulated and its unique nutmeg forests cruelly destroyed, at exactly the same time Ireland rapidly went from being among the most wooded countries in Europe to the least wooded. The great poem Kilcash uses that destruction as metaphor for colonial and ecocidal damage. Cadianamage fasta can almad, Tajeru nakolcha erlar. What shall we do without our timber? The last of our woods are felled. It's a great honor for me to welcome Amitav Ghosh from the Banda Islands to our green, damp sponge here in Ireland. Amitav.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today in Dublin, which is home of many of the writers I admire most, and particularly astonishing to find myself following Stephen Rea, whose work I've admired for such a long time. And it's kind of one of the miracles of being a writer, that you suddenly discover that people are reading you who you don't know, but who are far away, and yet there they are reading your books. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about my book, The Nutmeg's Curse. The story of the Nutmeg's Curse begins almost exactly 400 years ago in a very faraway place. Oh, that's not mine. So far away that very few of you are likely to have heard of it. The place is the Banda Archipelago, a tiny cluster of islands in the far southeastern quadrant of the Indian Ocean. The largest of these islands is only 2.5 miles in length and half a mile in width. So minuscule are the Banda Islands that on most maps they are marked only as a sprinkling of dots. The Banda Islands are the offspring of the ring of fire that runs all the way around the rim of the Pacific Ocean. A still active volcano, Gunung Api, of Fire Mountain, towers above the Bandas, its peak perpetually wreathed in plumes of swirling cloud and upwelling steam. Gunung Api is one of a great number of volcanoes in this stretch of ocean. The surrounding waters are dotted with beautifully formed conical mountains that surge majestically out of the waves, some of them rising to heights of over 1,000 meters or more. The very name of the region, Maluku, which gave birth to the English toponym Moluccas, is said to derive from Moloko, a word that means mountain or mountain island. The mountain islands of Maluku often erupt with devastating force. Yet there is also something magical about these convulsions, something akin to the pain of childbirth. For the eruptions of Maluku's volcanoes bring to the surface alchemical mixtures of materials which interact with the winds and the weather of the region in such a way as to create forests that teem with wonders and rarities. In the case of the Banda Islands, the gift of Gunung Api was a botanical species that has flourished on this tiny archipelago like nowhere else, the tree that produces both nutmeg and mace. Before the 18th century, every nutmeg and every shred of mace came from the Banda Islands. From textual sources and archaeological materials, it can be established that nutmegs and mace have been in circulation around Asia, Africa, and Europe since antiquity. So, despite their remoteness, the Banda Islands have been connected to the world through trade for thousands of years. Over the centuries, these spices became extremely valuable. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a handful of nutmegs could buy a house or a ship in Amsterdam or Lisbon. On what was the value of nutmegs founded? The idea that they were used to preserve food is a myth. The commonest of household ingredients, salt, is actually a far better preservative. Why then did these culinary condiments come to be so greatly valued? The answer is simple: because spices connoted a luxury, because only the affluent could afford them. They were like, the iPhones of their time, I suppose. In the late Middle Ages, nutmegs reached Europe by changing hands many times at many points of transit. The latter stages of their journey took them through Egypt or the Levant to Venice, which ran a tightly controlled monopoly on the European spice trade in the centuries before the voyages of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Columbus himself was from Genoa, where Venice's monopoly on the Eastern trade had long been bitterly resented. It was in order to break the Serene Republic's hold on that trade that navigators set off on the journeys that led them to the Americas and to the Indian Ocean. Among their goals, one of the most important was to find the islands that were home to the nutmeg. The stakes were immense for the navigators and for the monarchs who financed them. The spice race, it has been said, was the space race of its time. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach the Banda Islands in 1511, but others followed hot on their heels, first the Spanish, then the Dutch, and the English. What the Europeans had in common was that they all wanted to impose a monopoly on the trade in nutmegs and mace. The Dutch were the most relentless of all, sending fleets to the islands again and again with the intention of forcing treaties on their inhabitants. The islanders were few in number. There were only about 15,000 of them altogether, but they resisted so stubbornly that in 1621, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Jan Pietersen Koen, who is remembered today for coining the aphorism, "No war without trade, no trade without war," decided that the Banda problem needed a final solution. The islands, he decided, needed to be emptied of their inhabitants. Once the Bandanese were gone, settlers and slaves could be brought in to create a new plantation economy in the archipelago. So, in February 1621, Koen led a Dutch fleet to the Banda Islands and issued orders to the inhabitants to abandon their villages and leave their homes. Naturally, they did not comply. So in April 1621, Koen implemented his final solution. On his orders, in a period of a few weeks, the Dutch effectively eliminated the entire population of the islands. Several thousand were killed, several thousand died of starvation and disease, and the rest were enslaved and deported. Fortunately, a few hundred managed to escape to the surrounding islands, where they actually preserved the culture of the Bandas until the present day. What this picture shows is one incident in the massacre of the Bandanese when 44 of the headmen of the Bandanese were gathered together in this stockade, and then they were chopped up into little pieces by these Japanese samurai that the Dutch had hired because they had a settlement in Nagasaki. So they were cut up and they were thrown into these little wells, which have now become a genocide memorial on the island of Bandanera. So the corpses of these beheaded Bandanese chieftains were flung into these wells by Dutch officials. In short, within a few months, the Bandanese, once a proud and enterprising trading community, had ceased to exist as a people. Their world had been brought to an end in a span of less than 10 weeks. The Bandanese were thus amongst the earliest victims of a scourge that now threatens to engulf the entire planet, the resource curse. How should the story of the Bandanese be told? And does it even matter? After all, what happened in the Banda Islands was merely one instance of a history of colonization that was then unfolding on a vastly larger scale on the other side of the earth, in Ireland and in the Americas. It might be said that the page has been turned on that chapter of history, that the 21st century bears no resemblance to that long ago time when plants and botanical matter could decide the fate of human beings. It could be said that humanity has freed itself from the earth and the soil, and that we are now in an era when human-made goods take precedence over the products of the earth. So, what possible bearing could this centuries-old story have on our times? The trouble is that none of the above is true. Humanity is today even more dependent on botanical matter than it was 300 or 500 or even 5 millennia ago, and not just for food. Most people in the world today are completely dependent in every aspect of their lives on energy that comes from long-buried carbon. And what are coal, oil, and natural gas except fossilized forms of botanical matter? The sales of this fossilized botanical matter amount to over $10 trillion annually, and the trading and transporting of fuels generates another $3 trillion. No human-made commodity comes even close to commanding so large a share of global trade and shipping. If anything, it was in the pre-modern era that manufactured goods like textiles and porcelain accounted for a greater share of global trade. The truth is that human beings have never been more dependent on the Earth's provisions, botanical matter most of all, than they are today. The idea that modern man has freed himself from the planet is not just absurd, it's a dangerous delusion. Once the reality of humanity's ever-increasing servitude to the Earth is acknowledged, the story of the Bandanese no longer seems so distant from our present predicament. To the contrary, the continuities between the two are so pressing and powerful that it could even be said that the fate of the Banda Islands might be read as a template for the present, if only we knew how to tell that story. The horror of the story of the Bandanese lies in no small part in the fact that the narrative of their elimination from their land revolves around a tree, a species of incomparable value gifted to the islanders by the region's volcanic ecology. Yet, what can be said about the role of the nutmeg tree in this story? It's certainly true that the history of the archipelago cannot be narrated without reference to the tree, but it can't, for that reason, be said that the tree authored or decided the fate of the Bandanese. These questions bring us to the limits of a certain way of telling stories about the past. The empirical, documentary methods of historical scholarship depend critically on language, literacy, and writing. Its evidence comes primarily from written records and documents. In the stories that history tells, entities that lack language figure only as backdrops against which human dramas are enacted. Nutmegs, cloves, and volcanoes may figure in that story, but they cannot themselves be actors in the stories that historians tell, nor can they tell stories of their own. For Moluccans, on the other hand, as for many others who live in seismic zones, trees, flowers, and volcanoes are makers of history as well as tellers of stories. For the Bandanese, the landscapes, forests, and trees of their islands were places of dwelling that were enmeshed with human life in ways that were imaginative as well as material. The landscape did not exist solely to produce nutmeg. The Bandanese sang songs about nutmegs and volcanoes, and they told stories about them. For Jan Koen and the Dutch East India Company, on the other hand, the trees, volcanoes, and landscapes of the Bandas had no meaning except as resources that could be harnessed to generate profit. For them, the trees and volcanoes that were woven into the songs of the Bandanese contained nothing in excess of their utility. The idea that a volcano could make meaning would have been for them merely superstition or even idolatry. Nor, in the eyes of the Dutch colonists, was there any intrinsic connection between the Bandanese and the landscape they inhabited. They could simply be replaced by workers and managers who would transform their archipelago into a nutmeg-producing factory or a plantation. Now, this was a radically new way of envisioning the Earth, as a vast machine made of inert particles in ceaseless motion. Even in Europe, the mechanistic vision of the world had only just begun to take shape in the 17th century. And then, too, only among elites. The fact that it happened against the backdrop of the European conquest of the Americas was not coincidental. It was in the wake of the subjugation of those continents that educated upper-class European men began to think of themselves as the subduers of all they surveyed, even in their own countries, and especially within that domain they conceived of as nature, which they saw as an inert repository of resources, which, in order to be improved, needed to be expropriated, no matter whether from Amerindians or Irish or European peasants. But in this conception, nature did not apply only to non-human resources. People like Amerindians, Africans, Asians were similarly thought to belong to nature and were therefore also thought to be eligible for appropriation or enslavement or even extermination. Just like non-human resources, these humans too were regarded as mute, brutish, and devoid of agency. This conception is perfectly summed up in Shakespeare's Tempest by Prospero, when he reminds Caliban, his savage and deformed slave, of the most important gift that he, Prospero, has given him. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish. I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known. The essence of Caliban's brutishness lies then, not in his appearance, but in his inability to make meaning, even though he possesses the faculty of speech. In this framing, brutish humans cannot produce meaning, even though they possess the uniquely human faculty of speech. Their sounds amount to mere gabble until the colonizer gives them words, which endows them at last with the ability to make meaning. Until then, no matter that they have tongues, voices, and languages, brutes are effectively mute, like nature itself, which also makes sounds but produces no meaning. In this view of the world, the sounds of nature are not equivalent to utterances. They are the products of mechanical responses and reactions. The muteness of nature and the muteness of the brute are reflections of each other. Today, not even the most die-hard positivist or mechanist would claim, at least explicitly, though sometimes they do so implicitly, that there exists any category of humans who are mute or devoid of agency. But what then of non-humans? There are many people in the world, and many, if not most of them perhaps, are indigenous, who continue to believe that plants, trees, animals, and even geological features are neither mute nor lacking in agency. But very few of these people belong to dominant global elites, and even fewer are located within the academy. For historians, economists, and other academics, non-human entities are still seen as inert and incapable of agency. In that sense, their way of enframing the world still derives from the ideologies that rose to dominance in the wake of European empires in the 17th century. Within this frame, non-humans can never be anything other than inert, silent, and devoid of energy. So if you go to Trinity College or Notre Dame or wherever, economists can teach you about the trade cycles of the nutmeg, or chemists can teach you about the chemical composition of the nutmeg, but no one can teach you songs about the nutmeg. So an essential step toward the silencing of non-human voices was to imagine that only humans are capable of telling stories. This, again, is not an idea that people have always subscribed to. Many, perhaps most of the world's people still don't. It is essentially another elite idea that gained ground with the onward march of the mechanistic metaphysic. Yet today, the idea that humans are the only storytelling animals appears self-evident to those who subscribe to it. Consider, for instance, this passage from one of the finest portrayals of a landscape in contemporary literature. Graham Swift's superb 1983 novel, waterland. Only animals, says one of Swift's characters, live entirely in the here and now. Only nature knows neither memory nor history. But man, let me offer you a definition, is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys and trail signs of stories. This passage serves as the epigraph for a fine article by the environmental historian William Cronin. The article is on the nature of narrative, and Cronin argues that the fundamental difference between a mere succession of events, or what he calls a chronology, and a story is that the latter joins events together in a way that invests them with meaning. This, he assumes, is a specifically human ability. Hence, narrative, he writes, is a peculiarly human way of organizing reality. So what is really at stake is not so much storytelling itself, but rather the question of who can make meaning. Once again, the assumption is that non-humans cannot make or discern meaning. As with so many other attempts to define the exceptionalism of human beings, this idea is tenable only if meaning-making and storytelling are defined in a circular fashion, as being tied to human forms of language. But is it really the case that experiences cannot have any meaning in the absence of language? Clearly, this does not obtain for pre-linguistic humans. It is well known that even infants understand and make many kinds of meaning. So why should it not be possible to connect experiences into meaningful patterns in other ways, through memory, sight, or smell, for instance? Any pet owner knows that a dog understands as meaningful the relationship between the home, the park, and certain times of day. For the dog, is this a chronology or a narrative? Either way, it is clearly not the case that the dog lives entirely in the here and now. Its experiences are sequential and are understood to unfold in time and space. The importance of sequencing will be evident to anyone who has ever tried to write a story. A narrative is nothing if not an arrangement of a sequence of events. This is why the sentences that connect one paragraph to another are of such vital importance. They provide the sequential connections between events and places, out of which a meaningful narrative emerges. This kind of narrative sequencing is analogous to movement through time as well as space. That is exactly what is meant by the unfolding of a story. That may account for why so many of the world's earliest and most powerful narratives are stories that unfold through movement. For example, the Ramayana, the Odyssey, the Norse sagas, the Journey to the West, and so on. Now, it's well established that many animals have long memories and are able to communicate in complex ways. Some of these animals, like elephants, whales, and migratory birds, also move over immense distances and appear to have attachments to particular places. We are sometimes told that this is because of some sort of mechanical factor in the bird's brain, but no one's been able to isolate that mechanical factor to date. So it's clear that these birds and many other animals have attachments to particular places. Their movements cannot be described as purely mechanical, instinctive, or lacking in meaningful sequences. Humpback whales, for instance, mark the passage of time by changing their songs from year to year. This would hardly be possible if they lived entirely in the here and now. As far back as the 1930s, the biologist Jakob von, a name I cannot pronounce, demonstrated that many animals actively interpret their surroundings, creating their own experiential worlds. This idea has been anathema to those who believe that it's a cardinal error to attribute human qualities to animals. But as Eileen Christ has so persuasively shown in her book, Images of Animals, anthropomorphism and animal mind, to rigorously avoid anthropomorphism is only to risk falling into the related fallacy of mechanomorphism, the assumption that animals are machine-like creatures that cannot, in principle, be endowed with minds or interpretive faculties. If you think that animals don't have minds or interpretive faculties, how do you explain the phenomenon of animal suicide, which is actually very common? Elephants have been known to commit suicide, dogs commit suicide, parrots commit suicide by pulling out their feathers, and so on. In short, there are many good reasons to conclude, as Donna Haraway does, that storying cannot any longer be put into the box of human exceptionalism. The anthropologist Tom Van Duren goes further. In a fascinating study of a flock of penguins who doggedly return year after year to the shores of a Sydney suburb, he concludes that the bird's attachment to the place arise out of storying. He writes, I quote, "Experiencing beings like penguins represent the world to themselves too. They do not just take in sensory data as unfiltered and meaningless phenomena, but weave meaning out of experiences so that they, like humans, inhabit an endlessly storied world," unquote. It's perfectly possible then that far from being an exclusively human attribute, the narrative faculty is the most animal of human abilities, a product of one of the traits that humans indisputably share with animals and many other beings, attachments to place. Perhaps then, storytelling, far from setting humans apart from animals, is actually the most important residue of our formerly wild selves. This would explain why stories, above all, are quintessentially the domain of human imaginative life, in which non-humans had voices and where non-human agency was fully recognized and even celebrated. So if you go back to pre-modern narratives, all of them, no matter whether it's the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, they're filled with non-human agents and actors of all kinds. From the wind to animals to flowers and plants. And storytellers uniquely had the license to give a voice to these non-humans. Because to make this leap is simply impossible in other more prosaic domains of thought. I mean, you can't imagine an economist giving voice to, to non-humans. You can't imagine any other field of endeavor. But storytellers uniquely have license to do this, because everybody understands that a story exists in the domain of the possible, not necessarily the real, but the domain. Stories exist in a subjunctive mode. But this is a possibility on which storytellers have turned their backs since the onset of high modernity. And this has, in my view, played no small part in creating that blindness to other beings that is so marked a feature of official modernity. It follows then that if those non-human voices are to be restored to their proper place, then it must be in the first instance through the medium of stories. This is the great burden that now rests upon writers, artists, filmmakers, and everyone else who is involved in the telling of stories. To us falls the task of imaginatively restoring agency and voice to non-humans. As with all the most important artistic endeavors in human history, this is a task that is at once aesthetic and political. And because of the magnitude of the crisis that besets the planet, this task is now freighted with the most pressing moral urgency. Thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that and very enjoyable analysis of where we're at this stage in the human development. But I just wanted to make a point about the issue of religious exceptionalism in the terms of the whole concept of humans being exceptional. It's very much based in religion. In other words, that there's another world we can go to, therefore we can somewhat disregard the one we're living in. So in that sense, I think, if I could just make one other point in regard to Stephen Rea's contribution at the start in regard to Ireland's position in terms of climate change, and because of our history, we should be more aware than anyone else that we need to take much more constructive action to contribute to the real issues of climate change, which at the moment we haven't arrived at that stage. We're conscious of it. We have reacted against the poor efforts of the Green Party to face the major issues of climate change. So therefore, I think that's why we have to progress from here and make a re-evaluation. Thank you.
Well, the religious question is a complicated one, I think, because only certain religions think of, a human exceptionalism in relation to religion. And even they are actually not so sure about human exceptionalism. I mean, if you actually look at the practice of folk Islam, so many kinds of non-human entities are absolutely woven into the lives of villagers. I did my initial work in a village in Egypt, and jinns were everywhere. Jinns, afrits, which are certain kinds of ghosts, and saints, most of all. I mean, they had saints who flew. And, as you know, that's a very major part of Catholicism as well. So many, I think it's so wonderful that in Italy, you have the Madonna dell'Orta, of the gardens, the Madonna of the gardens. So I think it's, or if you think of Saint Francis of Assisi, really, he was a kind of shaman. He conversed with animals. His famous wolf of Gubbio was actually dug up and found. So I think it's only within a very sort of elite world that human exceptionalism is actually so completely accepted. Yesterday, I was speaking in Derry, and I asked the audience how many of them had seen The Little People, and you'd be really surprised by how many of them had.
I am one of those dreaded economists from Trinity. So my question is this. I feel that where the most resources, financial resources, have been put into storytelling have been in economics and business, where so much money has been put into understanding, cortisol reactions to Super Bowl ads, and everything from annual reports to brands are stories now. So in the kind of equation that you're implicitly giving, it's either data, scientific data, or stories. I would say, very unfortunately, we in economics, business management, et cetera, have been very good at hijacking that as well. So where would you see a re-hijacking of story, if it is story that is the route out of here?
It's absolutely the case that, the world was never disenchanted. Everyone lives in stories. So, for example, the stories that animate climate change, essentially, are stories that are founded upon myths of individuality, myths of entrepreneurship. These are absolutely fundamental to the culture that drives, greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, you can see that a person like Elon Musk, basically, he's still living in, those boy's own stories about conquering Mars and so on. And actually, that's all so much a part of, that kind of story is so much a part of. So, in effect, I think really, you're right. The economists and so on have, they pay attention to a certain kind of story, but none of those stories have non-humans in them. So I think that's a sure antidote, to that kind of economism.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I suppose I want to ask about, because at the basis of this climate breakdown, it's, and what Stephen referred to earlier, it's an ethical and a moral issue that we all have to somehow begin to think about and tell a story about, because it's not, the ethical and moral issue isn't being connected with the climate crisis at the moment. And I'm wondering, how might a story or stories be written about that? Because if we lose contact with our conscience around this, then we don't really have anything else left.
Well, there are so many ethical and moral issues in the world. And I'm sad to say that the fact of there being ethical and moral challenges doesn't seem to change anybody's mind about anything. In relation to climate change, I would say that the way that the whole problem is framed, especially in the global north, and especially amongst, how shall I say, people of good intention and liberal-minded people, is that climate change is an issue that can be solved through techno fixes or through the substitution of alternative energy and so on, and that if we were only ethical enough to do that, it would solve climate change. I think the view in the global south is quite different, and certainly I would say that I take a very different view of it. I mean, if you go to anyone in the global south and say, even to people who are losing their lands in front of your eyes, and if you say to them, don't you think you should, shrink your carbon footprint? What will their answer be? Their answer will be, why should I shrink my carbon footprint? They got rich by emitting more and more carbon at a time when we were weak and helpless. And now it's our turn, and we will never allow ourselves to be placed in that position again. So for them, within the global south, it's seen fundamentally, not in terms of solutions or in terms of a policy issue, it's fundamentally seen as a conflict and as a geopolitical issue, an issue of geopolitical injustice. So can that issue really be addressed purely by ethical or moral adjustments? It really can't. I mean, in effect, I would say that climate change is not a policy matter, it's a war. And we should recognize that it's a war. It's a war of the global rich against the global poor. And they fully expect, indeed they want, the global poor to die. This is the part that's not spoken out aloud. But when you see countries adopting accelerationist policies, that is what is absolutely implied. There's a huge literature on this, on the ways that especially the billionaires and so on are thinking about climate change. Many of the billionaires say nice things about lessening, solutions, lessening carbon footprint, etc. But at the same time, all of them are building themselves these apocalypse shelters. What does that mean? It means that they think that there's going to be this big collapse event, in which they will escape, to their shelters and bunkers and so on, while the rest of the world is consumed by this great Malthusian correction, which will wipe out billions of people. That's essentially their projection of how this is going to play out. So I think in this, one has to be very careful. There are things people say, and there are things that people do. And what is said and what is done in relation to climate change are, completely incommensurable.
I was actually going to ask you to expand on that last point a bit. I found very interesting that, which is where climate change and its consequences register on the emotional level. I suppose speaking in a kind of a mass way, that nature, weather, animals, landscape, that's always been part of the emotional register of human beings, ways in which humans understand their own emotional life. And I feel, my sense is that in contemporary emotional life, there is a sense that there's something wrong. And I think I think it's maybe partly behind mental health epidemics, and especially in the industrialized, in the rich world, there is, I suppose, a false consciousnness now that there is an emotional knowledge of what's going on, but a flight from that knowledge that is maybe registering itself on the emotional level. And I suppose what you're saying about storytelling is maybe connected to that, but I wonder if you could say something about that. But I suppose the emotional vocabulary or emotional landscape that surrounds climate change and these questions.
I think no one has spoken or thought or written about this better than Pope Francis. And what he's always talked about, and which the other global elites never talk about, is about changing your ways of thinking, changing your ways of life, changing your ideas about what is important in life, what is a good life. Have you ever seen any of that crop up in a COP document? Those ideas are just completely excluded. And I'm not Catholic or religious or anything, but I think he's the only one who really understands, because all the rest, changing to electric cars, changing to this and that, it's really just rearranging the deck chairs, you've just got to start with thinking about life and living in a very different way. And there, I think, actually, Ireland really can be absolutely a pioneer, because unlike, say, most of the rich world, these ideas of the vitality of the land and the landscape are still very alive here, much more so than anywhere else. And there, I would say the rights to nature movement is actually one very interesting way of approaching this issue, of according personhood to rivers, and as has happened in New Zealand, to mountains, as has happened in India, to glaciers, as has happened in Iceland and elsewhere. Similarly, now, as you probably know, there's a whole movement around Loch Ness. I think that could be really a kind of groundbreaking moment. And I think Ireland could very well be, at the forefront of the rights to nature movement. And of course, Stephen's been working on that for a long time.
I hope I can frame my question. It's following up on what you've been saying so far. But it seems that the narrative of post-colonialism is being used by China and other countries, mainly to challenge the power of the West rather than the ideas. If you look to China, it's hyper-capitalism. So in my mind, being provocative, looking for other ideas, there's almost a failure in the Eastern imagination to come up with something that really fundamentally challenges Western ideas in the ways that you're saying.
That's a very, very good question. Look, I think in the Chinese case, there are many ambiguities. For example, they've written rights to nature into their constitution. They've also, they're bringing online alternative energy at an astonishing rate. build more solar and wind facilities than the rest of the world put together by many times, many multiples. China, so I would say that China is a sort of an unusual case, but certainly I would say that India and Indonesia have fully accepted these extractivist, essentially colonial ideologies completely, and are now in the process of actually implementing them within their own countries, so that there's a kind of auto-colonization process going on. Certainly within India, where, you know, traditionally protected forests and so on are being turned over to mining companies, where all sorts of environmental regulations are being undone. Same is happening in Indonesia, and you're quite right. I mean, often the language that surrounds this is that of decolonization, etc., you know. So what we have really now, you know, if you think of, let's say, 100 years ago, when imperialism was in its heyday, you know, at that time, throughout the colonized world, there was a challenge, not only a political challenge to colonization, there was also a very profound intellectual challenge to colonization. So, for example, Gandhi said, and many other leaders in the global south said things like, we do not want to adopt the ways of life of Westerners. If 320 million, there were only 320 million Indians then, he said if 320 million Indians were to start consuming like Westerners, we would eat up the world like locusts, you know. So imagine what he's actually saying. He's saying that we will be content with a way of life that Westerners regard as poverty, you know. He was saying that, but this is not poverty, this is a kind of fulfillment. Would any leader anywhere be able to say that now? It's impossible. They would be thrown out of power immediately, whether it be in India or wherever. Remember, Jimmy Carter said, let's tighten our belts, and that was the end of him. You know, this is the thing. I mean, this is a kind of monstrous ideology that has us all in its grip, and it doesn't matter where we are from. But there is one very important thing here, you know, that we have to remember, that we are essentially engaged in a kind of mimetic rivalry. You know, so the person who says in the global south that why should we shrink our carbon footprint? You know, we want to be rich like them. This is essentially a mimetic expression that we want to be like, have what they have. And that might sound very frightening, because what if every Indian were to have, you know, like Americans, 2 or 3 cars and so on? I mean, of course, it would, you know, it would be ghastly. But the power of the whole mimetic relationship is that if the rich were to change their ways, then that would trickle down very, very quickly through the whole pyramid. It would change the entire mimetic equation, you know. So that's really the challenge. I mean, how do you change? How do you make those changes? How do you produce, again, as Pope Francis said, a better idea about what makes life fulfilling and worthwhile?
Thank you. Just a quick question. I'm interested in your sense of the role of education, broadly conceived, whether that's formal education, non-formal education, in addressing ecological crises. And I suppose the context where I'm coming from I teach in higher education, and what we're witnessing increasingly are things like academic capture, where global corporations are becoming very you know, invested in funding climate change and climate change centers, you know, centers that research climate change. And, you know, we tend to think of education as almost a panacea to so many different social and global problems and injustices. Do you have any thoughts on what role education can play in ameliorating this crisis?
Well, I think what you call capture has actually only made clear what has always been the case, which is that knowledge is power. I mean, going back to Francis Bacon, that was his idea of how to rule the world, through knowledge. And, his idea of the central governing entity would be a kind of university. And we see that, what you call capture has made that absolutely evident. But certainly, it's absolutely the case that it's educational institutions that teach and propagate, all the myths of capitalism that, that are now consuming the world. I mean, for example, I think most children who come out of an English educational system at some point or the other are made to read Lord of the Flies. And the Lord of the Flies is a certain imagining of how humans relate to each other, where, it's basically, in the absence of the state, people will just consume each other because they're all driven by the urge to dominate, all driven by the urge to accumulate more and more, which is a completely Hobbesian way of looking at it. The curious thing is that the whole Lord of the Flies scenario actually happened. A group of teenage boys, they drifted onto some island, and they were lost for I think it was like a couple of years, and ultimately they were found. But what happened was exactly the opposite of the Lord of the Flies scenario. They cooperated, they helped each other, they developed games, they lived, perfectly well and perfectly happily. But these were not Anglo boys, these were Fijian boys. I think that's the difference.
Thank you so much for that. I suppose maybe following up on that and some ideas around storytelling, I'm interested in kind of modes of storytelling, and particularly that your book, you've used the word parable as maybe a mode, I suppose. You mentioned the 17th century when that idea of kind of controlling nature, and you have the pastoral alongside of that, a very ordered nature. I think nowadays probably apocalypse is maybe the mode that we see most in like film, TV, books, and so on. So I'm just interested in maybe, do you think there are other modes out there, or what was the usefulness of parable as a way to approach some of these questions?
I was using the term parable because not so much in, in a scriptural sense, but rather because the structure of my book is parabolic. It's not, as it were, linear. So that was the reason I used it. But yes, I absolutely believe that we have to find new modes of storytelling. I wrote earlier a book called The Great Derangement, in which I may lay out this argument at some length, that modernist forms of knowledge, forms of storytelling, to my mind, are really exhausted and are incapable of coping with the enormity of what we are seeing. And my response to that was to turn away from modern writing, and I went back to reading pre-modern stuff. And I wanted to do it, and I wanted to read pre-modern things in a non-European language, because to some greater or lesser degree, all European languages are absolutely permeated with the language of early modernity and late modernity also. So I went back to reading, pre-modern Bengali narratives, and I found those really, really inspiring, because they represent they're so closely engaged with the environment, but also with various kinds of non-humans in such incredibly powerful ways. That was my response. And I would say, actually, that there are many, many writers who are responding also by writing, novels, stories, making films, and so on. So The problem, in a sense, is not that the writers are not doing their job. The problem is with the wider ecosystem of literature. You know, even when they write good books of this kind, those books don't find their ways into the elite review magazines. They don't find their ways onto the lists of elite prizes. So they come to be marginalized. In the same way that once science fiction was marginalized, you know. So if you think of Ursula Le Guin, you know, a writer of such immense importance and power, she was always treated as a writer of science fiction or fantasy or whatever. And it's very strange, you know, if you think of the English writers of the late 20th century, who even reads them now? I mean, like Angus Wilson and so on. Has anyone here heard of Angus Wilson? There you are. That was like the big writer of the 1970s and 80s and so on. No one even knows their names now. But everybody reads Ursula Le Guin. You know, that's the strange thing. What was treated as serious literature has vanished into nothingness, whereas what Ursula Le Guin did lives on.
I'm a big fan of the writers of this book, Climate, what is it? Fixing the Climate, Strategies for an Uncertain World. Charles Sable, Columbia law professor, and David Victor, something equivalent. And it's an example of one climate-related problem that has been solved. It's the ozone problem, the hole in the ozone layer. And the firms that were doing the wrong thing in developing carbon fluorochlorides for refrigerators and so on were turned around. These capitalist firms were turned around and started to develop alternative chemicals that wouldn't damage the ozone layer. And the developing countries that wanted to continue developing CFCs because there was money to be made out of that, they turned around as well. They all came on side and we solved the problem. It's not impossible that we might do that with climate change itself.
Okay, so firstly, the ozone problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it's come back. But, you know, there's been a very good study of the Montreal Protocol because it's always treated as the most successful example of environmental legislation. The study is called After Cooling by a guy called Eric Dean Wilson. It's really worth reading because he shows you that the way that it was maneuvered, the Montreal Protocol was maneuvered through the Canadian and the US legislatures was by presenting it as a white problem. They presented statistics and made it out to be especially dangerous to white people. That's why it got passed. So with climate change, it's exactly the opposite. The presupposition is that the people who will mainly die are black and brown people. That's why the people in elite circles, in the policy elites, are dragging their feet. They're not at all scared of that outcome. So it's a very interesting thing that this Montreal, I mean, the way that Eric has laid out, you know, he's tracked all the maneuvering around it. And it was literally this. They presented it as this is a threat to whiteness. That's what got it passed.
So I guess my question is, how do you make space for these stories and the indigenous relationship to the world without falling into the traps of exoticization and fetishization, or the trap of co-optation in the capitalist system, or even by placing the burden on this, like, being a quick fix to decades of damage without the decolonial change that needs to happen with it? Thank you.
There are no quick fixes. Let's just accept that there are no quick fixes, and quick fixes are not going to happen. Secondly, I would say that you know, your question is right on the mark, because a sort of growing field now is called traditional ecological knowledge, whereby people go into, indigenous communities and try to sort of extract their knowledge. It's fundamentally quite a sort of extractivist, pursuit. But the reason that they don't understand this is that they think that, let's say fire burning techniques were just a sort of technique that is separated from the way in which you live your life. But that wasn't the case. Fire burning had stories attached to it, it had seasonal rhythms attached to it, it had various forms of nomadism attached to it. You simply cannot sequestrate that as, it's not knowledge in that sense, it's actually a story. And until you learn to live that story, you can't use that technique at all. So, in a sense, I think one doesn't have to worry about, that being appropriated or whatever, because, all such attempts at appropriation will fail because it's part of a way of life, Secondly, I would say I understand very well why you're asking this question and why you have this anxiety about it. But if you're going to tell a story, you'll never even be able to start if you think of all the reasons why you shouldn't. I mean, storytelling, a lot of it is just jumping in, You shut your eyes and your ears and you take the leap and you assume that everyone is going to hate you. So that's just how it is.
I'm just thinking from my own point of view here in Ireland, we had an election and we had 12 people. The Green Party were going up for re-election. Every one of them were wiped out. I don't think one of them got in. And then climate change wasn't even on the agenda when people were going around asking what's happening or, what are you worried about? It didn't even get up there. It was so way down, it didn't matter to anybody. And I'm just thinking of Trump then getting in America, and he doesn't even believe there is such a thing as a climate problem. So I feel a bit sad that instead of getting anywhere, it's now going to the bottom of the pile. Do you think so?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The first thing I'd like to point out is that actually Trump, it's not that he doesn't believe in climate change. In 2009, he actually signed an ad in the New York Times asking for more action on climate change. He was one of many industrialists who did. He's perfectly well aware of climate change. He insures his properties against climate change in Scotland, in Florida. So the thing is, it's not like these people don't have a solution. Their solution is war. They see climate change as war. They see it as a way of, doing away with many people. That's their solution. The second thing is, yes, I think, it's not just Ireland. If you take the recent elections in Germany, the provincial elections, the Greens are just absolutely decimated. Going from something like 23% of the vote, they fall into 2 and 3. So there are many arguments one could have about, their policies and whether they were well executed or not. But one thing I think this does make clear is that environmental movements which model themselves on purely sort of like secular, policy-oriented parties, I don't think that that's a path to success. Because for one thing, the volunteers, the young people, they burn out. They burn out because how can you actually just live with what they live with all the time? They just run out of the spiritual resources, to cope with these things. On the other hand, which are the movements which actually become self-sustaining? And there are movements like Occupy, which repeatedly crops up in various places. I think Greta Thunberg can be traced to Occupy. Similarly, the No Dakota Access pipeline, No Dakota pipeline movement, which was entirely spearheaded by indigenous peoples and women, and which actually relied very much on rituals, on belief systems. Basically, for a while, their camps became the second largest cities in the Dakotas. Because basically what they were doing is that they were trying to invent a different way of life. I don't know how many of you ever visited the Occupy encampments, but that's what really struck me very much, because these encampments were about space, about living, and at that time everyone was scolding them, oh, what are your demands? Why aren't you just acting like a political party? And that's why they were not acting like a political party. Because what they were trying to do was to show you something else.
Sorry, my name is Grace. I'm very moved by it. My name is Grace, and I'm a poet. And one of my mentors was Joy Graham, who writes a lot of eco poetry. And she brought us all up to believe that, or to understand that the climate movement has been operating for a long time under the assumption that the data and evidence were gathered and presented, things would change, and that hasn't happened. And but I suppose as young poets who are trying to contribute to a way forward and take that task very seriously, of not only presenting information, but of making people feel something. And I'm interested in what you say about change and people changing their ways. I wonder, is there something you could say about perhaps changing our ways of seeing, to look at the natural world and not just see our preconceived notions about it or ourselves reflected back to us, but to actually see it?
Thank you. Well, if Jory Graham was your mentor, all I can say is that you were very well mentored because she's a quite exceptional poet. And I think poets have, in fact, led the way in responding to these, W.S. Merwin and so many others have always, but even going back much further than that, in fact, Kevin was saying how he thinks of W.B. Yeats as a major figure in thinking about the environment in a certain way. And I think from India, I could certainly say that Rabindranath Tagore was. And, Italy has a very long tradition of, poetry of that kind. So I think really, poetry can certainly do that. And I think what Jory is absolutely right. I mean, the data hasn't changed anyone's minds. People just shrug it off. So really, again, just to return to the point that I was making earlier, we have to be able to tap into that part of human existence which is not about mere matter, that part of not just human, I would say, just creaturely existence, which is rooted in poiesis. And who better to do that than poets? Dostoevsky famously said, that it's the beauty that will save us. And I think that's something that we have to try and remember when we are told about, electric batteries and this and that. They're not going to do it.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Emer Clary Delaney, and I'm the director of Notre Dame Dublin. I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to all of you for joining us today. This lecture is our flagship event for Notre Dame Dublin for 2024, and it forms part of the Notre Dame Forum, a campus-wide dialogue about issues of importance to the university as a nation and as the larger world. This year's theme is what do we owe each other, and it asks us to consider how should we individually, but more importantly collectively, think about our responsibilities to one another, but also to this sacred planet. As Notre Dame Dublin, we work in partnership with academic institutions, non-profits and local communities, building collaborative and community-based initiatives here in Dublin, around the world, and also back into campus in South Bend, Indiana. We hope that today's conversation provides a platform of further scholarly engagement that will shape our future thinking and deeper understanding of our own agency and collective responsibility to act upon the demands of the climate and the cultural crisis, resulting from a dearth of imagination. Thank you to Amitav Ghosh and to Stephen Rea and my colleague Professor Kevin Whelan for this truly insightful lecture. A special thank you to the organising team at the Royal Irish Academy of Music and our Notre Dame team who brought us all together. As we close, I hope that the ideas shared here will spark new opportunities for powerful conversations, for new stories, new narratives that reframe how we see this crisis and our collective responsibility to imagine a new way forward. Safe travels, and see you at our next gathering. Mila Buyakas.
Stephen Rea has been a bit under the weather, so he asked me to say this on his behalf. We've been honoured in Field Day and in the Irish Seminar at Notre Dame. They've had many distinguished global speakers, from Edward Said, Derek Walcott, Jacqueline Rose, Seamus Heaney, many, Edna O'Brien, many distinguished writers and thinkers. And it's a real honour to have Amitav as a part of that distinguished group as well. And Stephen would have asked me specifically to point out that Amitav did not charge us for doing this event tonight, which is an extraordinary generosity. So Amitav, we really appreciate that. No, you're going. And Amitav, we're now going to offer you an Irish homage, which is when we really, really admire and like somebody, we play music for them. And this evening, as a tribute and a homage to you, we have Neil Martin, who's long been associated with Notre Dame and with the Field Day Company, and is one of our most distinguished composers and musicians. So Neil is going to play what we call the slow air, Kilcosh, which is actually the tune on which the famous poem that Stephen read earlier is about. In other words, this is a lament for exactly what you were talking about. It's a lament for the loss of an environment, the loss of a storytelling culture, the loss of the inherited meaning, and the fact that all of this was just reduced to a brute metric of money and rapacious exploitation. So this is in honor of our guest, Amitav Ghosh, and it will finish our formal proceedings. So please join with me first in thanking Amitav for coming so far to be with us.